Hello and welcome, fellow motorsports fans. We've had a key round for junior Formula racing behind us with the mid-season reshuffle in Formula 2, a bunch of lower Formula and, crucially, the World Karting Championship in the relevant classes for us, and this is where we'll begin today. The FIA World Karting Championship in the single-speed categories has taken place at PFI in the UK last weekend, and in the OK Junior category everything was Kart Republic dominated. In particular, the Prema Satellite team was dominant in the difficult conditions that the final threw up, and as expected it was mostly British drivers excelling in the difficult British weather conditions, with Noah Baglin, Kenzo Craigie and Kip Belowski all at the front throughout the final. But there was another couple key competitors in there, most importantly rapid Austrian Red Bull Junior Niklas Schaufler, who was a firm win contender going into this, and he also performed like a win contender in the opening minutes, only to then get spun out by Kit Belowski, who subsequently also got penalized off the podium. So in the end it went wrong for both of them. Interestingly, Schaufler then got back onto the podium because of the Kip Belowski penalty, only to then get disqualified way after the race and after the podium. So it wouldn't really have mattered in the end anyway. Either way, this chaos left Noah Baglin and Kenzo Craigie battling for the win, and what an epic battle it was going into the last lap. I'll show most of it to you here. Yes, unfortunately it did end in heartbreaking contact for Noah Baglin, sending him into a wall before the last corner. But nonetheless, what a phenomenal run he has had all weekend and throughout the year really. But nonetheless, this leaves Kenzo Craigie as a very deserved world champion in this super stacked category. So definitely a name you want to remember. Obviously Mercedes Junior, we've talked about him a couple times throughout the recent weeks. And then last but not least, I do want to highlight that since Schaufler got DSQ'd after the race, we do actually have another Red Bull Junior inheriting the podium, because Rocco Coronel recently also got announced as a new Red Bull Junior. In case you aren't familiar with him, 13-year-old Dutchman, son of Tom Coronel. You may have heard of him if you've watched any sort of touring car racing in the last couple of years, for example. So this is another name to remember. He's been excellent all year, and there is no reason to suspect this won't continue into next season. In the OK Seniors category, we also had an epic wet weather showdown, as is expected at this point, and here it was less one-sided. It was a true Kart Republic versus CRG at the front, because there was really only two people racing for the win in this. We had dominated Joe Turney, who obviously has completed the European double already in the class, against a wildcard runner, Ethan Jeff Hall. That's a name you may have heard throughout various racing series this year. He's done a lot of karting, he's done Ginetta Juniors, is on to win the title there. So it is a name that has popped up a couple times over the recent months. I've watched the guy for a few years now, but nonetheless I did not expect this level of brilliance to come along from him. He was certainly a worthy replacement of Gabriel Gomez in this, usually front-running CRG seat. And yeah, he made the most of it, putting Joe Turney under pressure throughout the race. Joe Turney still looked in firm control to secure his title, only for him to then outbrake himself on the last lap, allowing Ethan Jeff Hall to get past and steal the world title from him. What a phenomenal storyline, and I really hope this kicks off Ethan Jeff Hall's career for good, gets him out of the, maybe dodgy financial situation I presume him to be in over the last couple of years, and really propel his way into the single-seater landscape, or at least so I would hope. I do want to shout out a couple of different drivers though. Unfortunately, a lot of our key competitors here, like Dries van Langendonk, Alexander Bondarev, Lewis Worrell, Salem Hanar, all had DNFs. It was a very sort of crashy, carnage heavy race, as you'd expect given the conditions. So instead, one guy we can shout out is another Red Bull Junior, Fionn McLaughlin in P5. He had an excellent weekend throughout. Yes, in the final he didn't quite have the pace required to go with the couple of front runners, but nonetheless a very solid performance. To be honest, this was the sort of run that, for example, last year for Kirill Kutzkov was enough to win the title, because the carnage happened at the front instead of in the midfield, as was the case this year. Anyway, let's not talk too much about karting. Let's go on to the F4 level. On the F4 level, we begin with the second round of Euro 4, obviously the championship sort of running together with Italian F4, and unlike at the first round where it was all about Akshay Bora, this time Prema was back properly and had Freddie Slater leading the charge as you'd expect at this point. He secured a hat-trick on track. Unfortunately, it didn't quite stand. He did get penalized. Actually, he got penalized after 2 of the races. In one of them, he still kept the win. In the other, he got penalized down to P3. So a bit unfortunate there. To be fair, Slater was getting his elbows out. He was racing very rough all weekend. It was fun to watch, but I mean, you can understand a penalty or two in these circumstances. Nonetheless, I think we don't even need to talk about it all that much. We know how excellent a driver he is at this point. More interestingly, it was actually Thomas Stolzenmanis this time, the Prema, to challenge him properly throughout the weekend. I find it really interesting how the Premas, aside from Slater, just really take turns of being good and being the one to rise to the occasion. Really, we've had Powell early on in the season, we've had Key Nakamura doing really well over the winter, and now this time around it was Stolzenmanis. Yes, unfortunately, he only secured a single second place. He could have had a lot better over the weekend. He did got roughed up a couple times, but I really hope this is a trend to continue in the future and he can finally find that first win, you know, at some point later in the year. I do want to put the spotlight on one of the, you know, unknowns on the grid. I've talked about him a few times over the course of the year just because of what a surprise he's been. And is Luca Visoriano, the Romanian driver, driving for also Romanian newcomer team Real Racing. And I do have to say he keeps performing miracles, scoring in the first race, just about missing out in the third race. So if he's not a fan favorite by now, then I really don't know who is. I think this guy is excellent to watch. And, you know, who doesn't like rooting for a good underdog, eh? Last but not least, a not quite as excellent driver to put the spotlight on here, and that's Thomas Behrman giving his debut, obviously Ollie's younger brother, and it was more or less what I expected it to be. It was a little mediocre, or well, it was pretty bad to be honest. Just to give my perspective on Thomas Behrman, I think he's a good driver from everything I've seen from karting, but I wouldn't expect him to be anything like Ollie. In many ways, I found the Charles and Arthur Leclerc analogy pretty decent, where Arthur is a capable racing driver in his own right, but he isn't his brother and he's not F1 material, and I think this is what we are looking at here with Thomas Behrman. Of course, I would love him to prove me wrong as always, but this is the sort of expectation I'm going into his career with, if that makes sense. We move on to Spanish F4, where the man of the weekend was DriveX ace driver Juan Cota with a dominant hat-trick really out of nowhere with a winless team, so him not only securing the first win of the team but also the second and the third all in the same weekend. So he was on an entirely different level to the grid this time out. Unfortunately, this goes hand in hand with his teammates being a little underwhelming in contrast. In particular, you know, Reba and Macedo have maybe been a little unlucky, but debutants Trapper and Oscar Wirtz were really nowhere to be seen. In particular, Trapper I haven't seen at all. Oscar Wirtz was struggling to impact the top 15. So given what Cota was able to do, his teammates really looked a little terrible throughout the weekend. The championship itself is still entirely up in the air with a bunch of key retirements sort of throwing things around. Most notably, all three of our championship protagonists, Keanu Alazari, Matteo Konagi and Maciej Gladish, retired on lap 1 in the first race. So that was definitely an interesting start to the weekend. Keanu Alazari still leads the championship, but honestly, with the amount of chaos this series typically experiences, and with 2 rounds to go, I do think it is pretty wide open. As always in these scenarios, Keanu Alazari looks worst of the lead 3 just by the fact that he is not a rookie anymore. In fact, I do think it's really Gladish who has been looking the most impressive so far over the course of the year. But of course, as far as the title is concerned, I do think Alazari is probably still the favourite. Last but not least, quick shout out to karting star Gabriel Gomez. We've just talked about Ethan Jeff Hall effectively taking his seat during the World Championship, and he finally managed to secure his first points here in Spanish F4 in the first race, and then he doubled up with a really strong P4 in the second race. Yes, there was a couple penalties further up the road to propel him quite as high up, but nonetheless, this is certainly a guy who you want to keep an eye on for sure. We knew this going into the season, we know he's rapid, and now he's shown it in single-seaters as well. Over to the French F4, and here we still have a truly epic title fight going on, and this time with a really interesting twist where obviously it's been largely Stephen Maidens versus Jules Caranta, those two sort of taking turns, taking the wins, and Taito Kata always lurking in the background just by scoring consistently but rarely ever fighting for the proper wins. This time though, it was him to find both pole positions and both regular grid wins ahead of Steve Maidens. So he is now back firmly in the mix for the championship. Steve Maidens still in the lead because he got a pair of P2s, whereas Caranta has been, you know, not quite his usual front-running self. Obviously, he still scored very consistently, no doubt about that, but it could have been a little bit better basically. For Steve Maidens, he lost a couple key points in the second race where he did get run into a wall by Bernier in turn 1, but as I said, still leading the championship. Then again, only 17 points separating the lead three, so really anything can happen going into the last round. I think just from what I've seen all year, first of all, again, obviously huge rookie bonus for Jules Caranta, but I also think he has looked the most impressive whenever the pair has actually gone wheel to wheel properly, so I'll still predict him to take it, even though it'll be an uphill battle for sure. Then, as is tradition by now in the French F4, we do have ADAC Spotlight with Montego Marsan actually building on the first good weekend he had last time out, and this time he was, you know, displaying proper front-running qualities that time throughout the weekend. He scored 2 podiums. He, for example, passed Jules Caranta to take one of those on track late in a race, so he actually also had to work for them, so really good to see. Matilda Patz also got very close to her first points. Again, this time she got a personal best result of P10, but since it was in the reverse grid race, still no points for her. Either way, it's only a matter of time now, I am sure. Those two aren't the only two rookies slowly picking up the pace and figuring everything out, because I also want to highlight Dylan Astra, who's been very good this time around and really much like Montego Marsan, all of a sudden going from pretty forgettable anonymous down in the midfield to almost front-running upper midfield kind of driver. Yes, he still went backwards a couple of times after starting high up the order, so certainly he hasn't figured it all out yet, but certainly another late season improvement from the rookies, and these are the two most interesting drivers right now if they were to stay around for another year. Anyway, those were a lot of F4 series. On we go to Quicker Machinery. In the Quicker Machinery, there's actually only one proper series here because Euroformula Open was incredibly boring, so I didn't really bother to watch it all, and we're not going to talk about it anymore for the time being. Instead, we focus on the big one, obviously, on Formula Regional European Championship, good old FRECA. And here we did have a very curious round in terms of the title battle because neither Tappanen nor Kamara scored properly. Kamara got 1 P8 in a mad recovery drive despite losing his front wing on the first lap, whereas Tappanen didn't score at all. So either way, a bit of a messy race. I do want to highlight Kamara also lost this front wing entirely by himself by running into the back of someone. So maybe, you know, nerves kicking in with the two, but realistically it was also just a very tricky weekend in difficult conditions at the Red Bull Ring. So, you know, these things can happen. I want to highlight, as always, the other side of the Prema garage because James Wharton got his second win this time out in a controlled lights to flag race in pretty tricky conditions, I might add, while Yugo Chukwu continues to disappoint, and I think we've reached a new low in this, whereas recently I've highlighted, oh yeah, he looked very good in the wet at least and capable of fighting, and maybe he can then outdrive a car. People in the comments have been speculating he's got a shit engine, you know, again, something you can probably compensate for a lot better in difficult conditions. And here, not only did he not compensate for anything, but he actually lost out to recovering Kamara in the second race. So finishing behind the teammate who had to replace his front wing is about as bad as it's going to get in a spec series. So this is really looking a bit grim for next season. I am really interested to see where Yugo is going to end up. spotlight on a different team for once. Focus on ART because yes, Andreolo is a non-factor, not really worth talking about, but both Gilles and GOC do put in a fight every now and then, and it is pretty fun to watch. Gilles is clearly massively talented. Again, we knew this even before he stepped into a single seater, never mind after winning the French title in his rookie season, but he has been getting unlucky quite a bit so far this year. Nonetheless, I do want to highlight this move, taking GST around the outside for P2 in the first race on a wet track. So yeah, kid can drive, and I do hope he stays around for title charge next season. He is still behind in the rookie standings though, behind rock solid rookie Noah Stromstad, who has yet another double score weekend, yet another P2. At this point we are getting used to seeing him on the podium, so really a driver worth watching still. But I want to focus on Spanish F4 champion Teofinal instead, who has finally showed the ability he has sort of teased over the winter, and here he got a controlled P2 throughout all the carnage in a very messy race. And here he had a very controlled second race throughout all the carnage to finally take his maiden victory in the series, so congratulations there. Although of course it is too little too late. I really wonder what went on there, if Centerlock dropped the ball or if he just got really lucky throughout the Formula Regional Middle Eastern Championship. But either way, he is another candidate who I would really like to see stick around for a second season and properly see him fight at the sharp end as he deserves. Anyway, time to talk about the big chaos in F2. Formula 2 obviously saw a lot of drama, including a big crash at the start of the feature race, but there is only two key storylines we need to track really at this point in the season. First of all, Gabriel Bortoleto taking the championship lead from Isaac Hadjar, and this really is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, Bortoleto continues to just perform very consistently at the sharp end of the grid and is really phenomenal to watch, but I can't help but feel that Hadjar is just incredibly unlucky still and just can't catch a break. This time a no-score weekend, just disappointing, stuck down the order. I don't know if it's him, if it's like the title battle getting to him at all, but to me it also massively looks like Campos dropped the ball combined with he got very unlucky early in the season. So I am really sad to see him lose this title. I hope he can still secure it. I think he is the deserved champion. I've said this a couple times throughout the season. But either way, time will tell how this plays out. There's also Kimi Antonelli, of course, getting another podium. Victor Martin finally scoring another good result in P2. So these are all like neat little storylines. But really the focus this week should be on the roster moves and on the debutants that had their chance here at Baku. We had debuts from Gabriele Mini, Christian Mansell and Luke Browning, replacing Ollie Behrman, Roman Stanek and Zach O'Sullivan respectively. Sure, for Behrman, he was of course there to replace K-Max, so he got the step up to F1 for the weekend, but the other two are somewhat interesting cases. Stanek leaving was announced a couple months ago, and while I wasn't in favor of him leaving early because I still thought he had something left to prove, honestly the way Vershaw has been handling him this season probably makes it a pretty sensible decision. I don't think there was anything to gain for Stanek by staying in F2 for any longer, paying the mad amounts of money you have to pay. So fair enough on all ends there. But Zach O'Sullivan leaving mid-season despite being a Williams Jr. is incredibly odd and definitely shouldn't be happening. I don't know why Williams isn't supporting him appropriately. Yes, there have been these like rumors that Williams doesn't really support their junior drivers properly, but I really feel like he has been doing pretty well given the fact Art has been struggling. He's a rookie, so sure, he's not been blowing anyone out of the water, and I do get that Williams probably don't need another rookie coming out of F2 in the near future, but still, yeah, I don't really know, and this is the sad side of following these junior formulas in my opinion, that people like this have to leave for no apparent reason other than obviously money. Anyway, obviously we want to talk about their replacements, and here especially I have to highlight both Gabriele Mini and Christian Mansell fighting for podium spots in the sprint race. Yes, it's obviously only the sprint race, but nonetheless, quite an excellent performance on a very tricky track, and in particular from Gabriele Mini, who actually succeeded in keeping the podium position. Yes, Mansell slowly slipped down the order after he eventually, finished his tires and dropped off a cliff a little, which, yeah, somewhat sad, but nonetheless a very good debut drive. And then Luke Browning was more on the quiet side, but very solid, and he also ended up having the best feature out of the trio and actually scoring pretty decent points, whereas the others were a little more on the quiet side in the feature. All in all, I do want to say all three of them clicked with the car very well for debut. That really stood out to me, and in particular because we have the contrast with Oliver Goethe, who also stepped up a week earlier in Monza and is still struggling considerably compared to the other three, in my opinion. Last but not least, we had Joshua Dirksen. After teasing it a couple times throughout the season that the potential is there, he actually now managed to find his maiden victory in the sprint race, continues the sick performances we've talked about a lot of times, and I only learned this during the broadcast, I am ashamed to admit, that he is backed this much by his own country and apparently like having phone calls with the president after getting on the podium and stuff. So I think he is just a really cool storyline playing out this season. Yes, I still think there is some sort of BS going on until I'm proven otherwise by him performing well in a different car next year or something. I won't buy into it fully, but nobody can say anything bad about the season he's having, this is for sure. Over in the big show, in Formula 1, we of course also have a couple feeder series storylines playing out. Yes, at the front we had Piastri versus Leclerc, flawless race from Piastri, a bit of a, crashy performance at the end from Carlos Sainz and Checo Perez. A very controversial crash, of course, where I want to point out that the crash itself is about as racing incident as it gets. But I want to highlight Sainz did kind of kickstart it all by even trying to take the outside of Leclerc instead of actually taking the apex of the corner properly and, shutting off any attack from Perez. So that was a little odd, I think. He could have prevented this by just racing a little smarter, I think. But don't get me wrong, this isn't trying to put the blame of the actual crash on Sainz at all. I think this is about as 50-50 as it gets. Now, of course, two more not really debutants, but almost both in their second ever F1 weekend, Franco Colapinto and Ollie Behrman, and both actually scoring points, and we really want to highlight Colapinto in particular, out-qualifying Alex Albon as well. And for all those that doubted whether or not this was the correct choice, obviously I've been saying as much, where replacing Sargent Good, bringing in Colapinto, tiny bit questionable, and I think he has shut us all up pretty effectively here, no more questions. He has already achieved more in a single race weekend than Logan Sargent has achieved all year long. Anyway, let's not waste too much time talking about the things you've all seen. Let's talk about some NA racing instead. Just a quick side note, yes, we are in fact going to skip the Japanese racing, in particular because I was outraged at the Super Formula Lights broadcast quality this time around, because they weren't part of the Super Formula broadcast, and it was a proper mess to watch and not really worth anyone's time, in my humble opinion. Instead, we begin with IndyNXT, where yes, Louis Foster has locked up the title last week obviously, but here he did make sure to end the season in style, securing win number 8, making it an incredibly mad season where he went top 2 11 out of 14 times, podium 12 out of 14 times. So truly just a nutty season all around, and a deserved champion who we hope can secure an IndyCar seat of some sort for next year. There was two other more important stories occupying the other podium positions though. First we had Yuvan Sundaramurthy, who I know that name is one I'm going to butcher every single time, but it is what it is. Either way, he had his by far best drive of the year, charging through the pack all the way to P2 and even challenging Foster a little bit after a late race safety car, so brilliant drive there. And given the fact he is confirmed for another full season program next year, I do believe he will be one of the key players to watch in the title fight next season. The overwhelming title favorite going into next season though is Kaya Colette, and here we've talked about his learning curve on the ovals, and I am very happy to report he has also finished his season with his first oval podium, and he has really looked on it throughout the race. Yes, he lost out to super rapid looking Sundaramurthy, but nonetheless the average performance has looked very good. He has improved consistently, believably so. So now that this particular weakness he is also slowly getting rid of, I think it's going to be very difficult to stop him from just taking the title by storm next year. And then, last but not least for the day, we had a slightly anticlimactic IndyCar title fight with obviously Alex Palou and Will Power technically going up in an epic 101. Yes, of course, Power was down quite a few points. It was going to be a very tricky uphill battle at the best of times, but unfortunately he lost a ton of time pretty early on in the pits due to a loose seatbelt, which you don't see that all that often. So essentially he did hand Palou his title, although it has to be said Alex Palou really had one of his more quiet races, just quietly driving home to P11 finish, not where he is usually at, but that's all he had to do this time out, and so he did. We've talked about it a few times, but Alex Palou just clearly one of the best racing drivers on the planet right now. It's very sad that he is only doing IndyCar and very, very rare appearances in WEC. I would love to see him try his hand at some more different stuff, but either way, he is a pleasure to watch every time he steps into a racing car. A more interesting storyline though is actually Colton Herta and Andretti managed to steal P2, with Power getting unlucky here, and obviously the rest of the Penske boys all having their moments of bad luck and disqualification and all sorts of things. And actually also McLaughlin managed to sneak his way back into P3 of the championship. So all in all, a bit of an odd weekend to end the IndyCar thing with, but it does leave us with a lot of optimism going into next season, with hopefully Andretti fighting for something properly. Both Herta and Kirkwood really looked on it at times throughout the season, and then also Pato O'Ward again being back looking very good in his McLaren, and I do hope this trend can continue and not just immediately die off again in the early rounds of the season. Last but not least, Meishank Racing yet again missing out on a big result despite looking very promising, but they have announced that Felix Rosenqvist will indeed stay on for another season. So while he did get really unlucky actually a couple times this year, I am looking forward to see what he can do in another season with another teammate, and hopefully also get the results that match what they do on track weekend after weekend. Anyway, as always, this was really a lot, probably the last super stacked race weekend of the year in some ways. So let me know all of your opinions down in the comments about the IndyCar title fight, about our F2 debutants, about how much you all now love Franco Colapinto. All of your thoughts down in the comments, especially if you've managed to catch up with some kartings. You know I love that. And otherwise, I'll thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.